I wanted to talk about falling in love with art again this week and the beauty that comes from being an artist and the pleasure that kind of comes from creative pursuits. So, hi, hey, hello. If you're new here, my name is Rain. If you're not new here, welcome back. I really appreciate you stopping on by to my little corner of the internet. This is another sketchbook session, so get cozy. And if you feel like being creative alongside me, I would love to see it or hear about it down in the comments if you feel comfortable sharing. Uh, Send it to me on the socials, tag me, all of that fun stuff. I'm always happy to support you all the way that you support me. So, with all of that being said, let's just talk about the sketch and what I got up to this week. I really like imposing women, and I especially like women who are kind of deceptively soft. And so I felt like bringing some weaponry into my sketchbook and actually drawing something that kind of fits that narrative a little bit more and kind of brings out those characteristics of somebody a bit more like visually was a good experiment for me to engage with, especially since I'm not very accustomed to drawing weaponry. A lot of my original characters are magic users or they kind of control nature in some capacity. So they aren't necessarily wielding weapons that would be like directly identifiable for actually like some form of kind of violent activities, I guess would be the best way to put it. Like, it's just not something that I kind of feel myself being inclined to very often. My first for foray into drawing something kind of even similar to this was my drawing back in October of Alucard for Drawtober, and even then I really don't feel like I kind of captured any of the feelings that I actually am interested in evoking because that was predominantly fan art, and so drawing a femme fatale version of Alucard is kind of a whole different ball game than me going out of my way to deliberately kind of think about how I would want a character to look and their physical appearance and the way that I would like to kind of pose them and stuff. And so I went into this with not a lot of high expectations for how it was going to turn out. I was expecting it to go worse than usual in terms of how my projects typically resolve just because I am pretty out of my depth with this. I went for a very loose, kind of generalized clothing form. Is it a sweater? Is it an oversized button down? I'm not sure. I kind of intentionally wanted the clothes to be very much out of the way and not super prevalent, something that doesn't really like draw your attention in because I don't really want that to be the main focus. I made the head the kind of predominant vision and then the weapons covering over part of the face, near the face, kind of angling towards it, directing your attention towards all of that middle center shebang because I really felt like it was the main thing that you're supposed to be looking at, right? It's a close body shot. And of course, this is on a sketchbook page that I also did a thumbnail for a kind of looter portrait for some fan art I'm planning on doing. So, really, it wasn't actually supposed to be a particularly big project from the get go when I rendered out the sketch, right? The sketch off to the right hand side of the composition is not something I'm actually going to be doing in this video. I'm really just focusing on the girl that I have covered in the red marker. I know you can't see the sketch right now, but I did want to include the general way, sped up, of course, that I kind of map out doing a marker base layer for what is going to be a paint illustration with a background, right? I didn't plan a background. Well, I didn't plan a background that required any details for the sketch I'm actually going to be doing in this video, but I still have the chunky, broad tipped markers out, and I really hate where I keep these, but I don't have anywhere better for them. So I really just wanted to get this done and out of the way before I even needed to think about maybe actually how I want to render this. You know, it's a forest scene. This is a follow up sketch for my bog lady, which I will have that video linked up in the cards just because it is like my magnum opus of art. I love that sketch so much. I really love how that drawing turned out. So if you want to go see another video where I do a very similar technique in terms of like background and building up colors, and I do actually finish a hot bog mommy That is going to be linked up above. But actually, in terms of this sketch, I wanted it to be a red base layer because I wanted something fiery and kind of passionate. And I've been informed a couple of times that I do actually tend to overuse red in my illustrations. I tend to go a little bit too heavy handed, and perhaps I need to tone it down a touch more. My red is a bit too intense when I actually do use it. And I think it's because I very rarely actually feel inclined towards the color red and actually kind of dedicating it a significant portion in any sort of illustration. I dedicate red mostly to the under eyes of my OC Eris, right? And then her top shadow is kind of like a red eyeliner, basically, the thick red eyeliner. And then, maybe like a tie, or perhaps I'll have a little bit of red in the flush on the cheeks just to make it really overemphasized. But otherwise, I very rarely give the color red some sort of kind of strong, impressionable opportunity in my illustrations. It's just something I'm not super dedicated to. And I think because of that, I just don't have the experience to understand when red is maybe a bit too much, right? I I don't really realize how overwhelming it can be just because I work with it so rarely. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of red actually like in my day-to-day life. A lot of my other art isn't like it, so it just kind of feels diluted. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't really think of my art in the singularity as much as I do kind of like how does all of my art overall kind of convey these colors, right? And so it's a bit overwhelming, and I think that I maybe probably should have started with an orange base color. It would have kind of had a similar fiery passion feel without being so overwhelming and overbearing. And you probably all could have seen my sketch a little bit better instead of kind of just trusting me to know what I'm doing, right? I can see it as purple under red, which is another reason why I was really confident in the purple sketch for this drawing. I knew it would go very well with the red, and I would lose my sketch pretty easily and not need to kind of worry about it, honestly. So it's right. It did make my tendency towards an orange flush look a little bit less spot on or a little bit less kind of desirable. I do really like an orange toned flush to my characters recently. I feel like there's something deeper about it than a pink flush. And maybe that's just because I feel like pink flushes are a little bit too common. And so the orange just gives it a little bit more oomph for me. Also, I already knew at this point that I wanted to incorporate a lot of blue into this illustration. I wasn't sure if I wanted it to be the hair or the shirt at this point, but I knew the orange undertones would be complementary, even if it mostly ended up getting covered up by the skin tone later. Now, as I talked about in my bog illustration, and I think I probably articulated it a little bit better then, um, these Arctic paint pens and I are not the best of friends, and so I have to work in a very particular manner to get my illustrations where I want them to be. And that's because they have a kind of sheer watery formula to them. Like, they're not as opaque as I maybe want them to be. It's a large part of the reason why I have started to really incorporate a full page undertone to my illustrations because it's easier for me to tell when is my marker not laying down as opaque as I want it to and how many more layers do I need, right? With the white paper, these like skin tones really start to look good right out the gate. And then the more you work with it and the more you layer it, the more you realize, oh, this is really whited out. Like it's creating this kind of pale, ashy tone to everything because I didn't realize how much the white of my page was actually showing through. The red, the dark green for the bog lady. I'm using a lighter green for the other bog lady. We'll see how that goes in the distant future. I have not touched that drawing since. So we'll see how it goes. But you can see like the red undertone is very obvious the paper, the marker base layer is really showing through. And so, okay, hey, I need a lot more layers. I have a lot more to do before this is actually the color I think it is and it's opaque. And on top of that, having a red undertone, like, we bleed, we flush, right? And so having a red undertone is a lot more natural than I think that kind of stark white paper sheen that I was getting with previous marker illustrations. And I've been really liking the way that this works for making my illustrations stand out and look a little bit more finished and polished in my sketchbook, even though that red marker kind of base layer is super blocky and patchy and it really isn't actually all that well done. It, as a personality and kind of a point of interest, that even if it's not necessarily something I thought through or actually committed to fully exploring, I guess you could say, is still something that you can look at and kind of find some form of intrigue, or it doesn't just make everything stand out. So, one way to think about this is like when you actually do like a proper painting, oil paint or acrylic, people always talk about putting kind of like a burnt umber or some sort of base coat because it kind of impacts the way you think about your colors in reference to each other. I found my color theory has been a lot better using this marker base layer method than with the white paper. It helps me harmonize my drawings a lot better. And so I think I've been producing more desirable sketchbook work, even when I'm not actually trying to create a finished illustration, right? My Bog Lady originally wasn't supposed to be a finished drawing. This wasn't supposed to really get realized to such a desirable extent. I know that doesn't like mean much right now, but I really love how this sketch turned out and I'm really proud of it. And I think it's because my colors are so much more harmonized by the fact that I have that base layer that helped to kind of keep everything in line and remind me of what I wanted the overall theme and vibe of the drawing to be. And I'm getting increasingly more attracted to this method, and I'm very excited to see how it improves my drawings overall in the future. And I don't know why I didn't think of it before. Like, I use marker base layers all the time for other things. Like, I don't actually render my marker illustrations super well with markers. I do add my gradients, I do add my harsh shadows, but I always end up eventually going over them with colored pencil to add more tonality, make the everything feel a little bit more blended and to my liking, right? Like, I go in with colored pencil and the marker is more so a base layer for kind of a more textured and interesting piece overall. Why didn't I think about doing that with paint pens a little bit more broadly? I guess would be the best way to describe it. Like, I'm not super unfamiliar with laying down like a skin color and marker and then going over it more with a paint pen later, evening out tone and things like that. But this just feels so much more like direct and intelligent. Like, why didn't I just do this in the first place? This feels like it makes more sense as a first step for learning how to use paint pens as someone who doesn't know how to paint than actually just adding it on top of a mostly rendered marker illustration. I don't know how I didn't have this revelation before, but now that I've had it, I'm having so much fun with my art and I'm having so much fun in my sketchbook. Like, I love sitting here and working on these little drawings, even though I have other doodles around them that make it so that they don't really feel like a finished piece. I'm really enjoying this process and I feel like I'm falling in love with art again. And it's been a very rewarding and comforting experience, I guess would be the best way to put it. So the rest of the drawing from here was mostly on a whim. I had an idea for how I wanted the piece to end, but everything from this point onward to basically near the end of the video, I will tell you when. I'm mostly going off of instinct and hope that things will work out the way that I want them to. Now, I have some personal gripes with the Arctic paint pens in terms of personal preference, and so there are some gripes that I have and some kind of intuitive decision making that I have to do that don't always work out the way that I want them to, but I kind of just have to go with it and work around and hope that it works out. And so there are a few pretty annoying hiccups in this process after here, but it's not entirely my technique. It's more so the material just wasn't what I wanted and I was too lazy to go get something better. And so it will come up, but for the most part, once I decided that the hair was going to be blue, I just kind of turned off my brain and started going for it, as I tend to do. Like, there's one big decision I need to make, and that's it. Everything after that, the brain is off. It's gone. I'm not here anymore. And that's just how this ended up happening. And so this is where I ran into my first irritation with the Arctic paint pens, and it's that I don't even use the color blue that much. In terms of the colors I use a lot, blue is not one of them. Um, well, it's not the color I use the most, and so the fact that these paint pens, the blue ones, tend to be kind of drier for me is incredibly irritating because I know I have not used this paint pen that much, if at all, and yet laying down this flat color was a battle. I literally turned off the camera because I had to keep violently shaking the marker, smacking it against the palm of my hand to try and get it to actually produce enough kind of paint to lay down a not even relatively even base layer. Like, you can see how the marker dried up basically everywhere after I was done kind of filling in the outline, getting those basic shapes done. So much so that I had to kind of scrap the way I usually render hair in favor of trying to find a way to make it look a little bit less patchy, just because the paint, that the color I wanted the base hair color to be, just was not working out for me, and it was causing increasingly more issues. So I did kind of go against my usual style and method for rendering hair, but I think it worked out really well and I did save it. But it was like my first irritation with the sketch that came up. And this kind of brought my attention to the fact that I have not broken this bad art habit that I have had the entire time I've kind of I've been an artist, right? And that's the fact that I don't go light to dark or dark to light. I always try to figure out what I want my middle point to be, and then I darken and lighten accordingly, which is just kind of like not how anyone teaches you to do an art project or like render a color. But I just know that my workflow would probably be so much more efficient if I started with one and then built up. No, it would have to be starting dark and then going light just because of the way that I render and process information. I know that once I place my shadows, I would get frustrated and I would still need to go back in with the lighter color that I want. So I would be the type of person who has to work dark to light, which is very beneficial for me, seeing as I do work with paint pens the most now. However, when it came to even like marker illustrations, I still worked medium first, and then I would lighten things with other mediums. Like, markers were the main component of my art, but I've always been a mixed media person, and I've never stuck to just one medium in an illustration. Well, that's a lie. I do just like line art for my botanical illustrations, like they're just strictly pen. Um, I don't go in with like watercolor or markers or things like that. I really like the kind of classic vintage kind of line art look for those, and that's just like a personal preference, but that's like a different art style in a different realm of reality. That's a different version of me that only pops onto the YouTube channel like once a year. She's not here 99% of the time, maybe 99.99% of the time. But when it comes to me like doing character design and things like that, I really hate sticking to just one medium. I don't like the limitations it creates for me. And I don't even think that they're real limitations. I think that they are kind of like perceived limitations because I don't actually know my mediums like to a T. Like, if I was a master marker illustrator, I wouldn't feel limited working in only markers. But because I'm not, I'm like, but the paint, it makes doing the lights so easy on top of my medium tones. And I don't know if it's because I like built up that habit and now I'm having a really hard time breaking it, or I don't really know how to reconceptualize the way that I process light and dark and color and all of that, or if it's just something wrong with the way that I process information overall that makes thinking in that like linear scale particularly challenging for me. So I don't know, but I work medium to light, and that kind of bit me with the medium tone for the hair being really dry, because I couldn't go back in with the medium tone to go back and kind of like fix mistakes or kind of oomph up that base color. And I had to kind of switch hair color through rendering to actually kind of make it look consistent and linear. And it threw my brain for a loop. And I ended up kind of scrapping a chunk of the hair, you'll see later, through what I already knew I was going to do. Like, I just gave up partway through and just hoped that it would work out. It did, but it's totally ill advised that you ever just say, screw it, I'm gonna just hope. Like, it was a horrible decision, and I really shouldn't be rewarded by the fact that it worked out for me. Um, Secondarily to that, a big part of the reason why I chose that mid-tone for the hair was because I wanted the mid-tone to be similar to the weapons, right? I wanted them to, like, if you squint, it would be hard to distinguish them apart, so that I can really push the difference between the hair and the weapons through the shadows and the highlights. And thus, changing that mid-tone kind of did make me a little bit more confused as to where I wanted which to stand out more. And I ended up having to kind of subvert my plans a little bit from what they were before I started rendering. Like, my brain just kind of went, ugh, let's hope. So in that, I just kind of scrambled to lay down any sort of dark colors that can start kind of dissecting the hair into front, middle, and back. That's kind of usually my go-to if I start panicking about something, is like, okay, what can I do to at least push some sort of illusion of a sense of depth? And usually that is just kind of placing down super light and super harsh colors to form some sort of cell shading to kind of just hopefully approach this idea that perhaps there's a little bit more going on. This isn't the most flat image on the planet. I know that that kind of thinking is maybe a little bit silly since I do 2D illustration and I don't have a realistic style, but I want my piece to feel at least somewhat lively, and thinking kind of back, middle, forward is kind of just a necessary step for me to actually make sure that my pieces have an appealing enough composition. It's just kind of what helps me to process, okay, am I actually checking all of my boxes? And I think that's kind of why I'm able to be so fluent and kind of up in the air with my colors, because I always at the very least try to, regardless of the color I'm using, still ensure that I'm achieving a sense of foreground, middle ground, and background. So at this point, I had kind of achieved some level of base level panic about like what I was going to do with the hair and how I was going to approach kind of fixing the issue that I had accidentally created by using that blue paint pen, which I really should have just tested it a little bit more beforehand, but I feel like they always run out when I'm trying to fill in like a space of area, and so when I like check to see if it feels dry on the scratch paper, it works out. And that's something I've noticed that about the Arctic paint pens again that really kind of frustrate and irritate me, is that they don't have a way to pump out more paint. Like this just kind of flows, it just kind of happens, right? It doesn't have the pushing mechanism that like a Posca, the Ohuhu, or the Grabby Art have. However, you can't really have that method with a brush tip either. So I've generally found that like having the push release button, a squeeze method, or a crank system works, but like you can't just like push more paint to the tip of the Arctic's paint pens. You just have to cap them, shake them, and hope more paint kind of saturates the tip. And I don't even work that big and they run out of kind of paint quickly. You know, it's not like I'm working on some massive piece of paper and this is like a large illustration and I'm covering a lot of surface area. Like the hair on this piece is like not even taking up the space of my palm if you put it all together. Remove the face, you know, like actually like just condense it into a circle or something like that. It's like maybe the size of my palm. Like this is a small sketchbook, not, it's like 5 by 8.5, and this illustration doesn't even cover the whole page, let alone the hair. It's just like, it's kind of frustrating for me because for me, like the paint pen method is the way for me to incorporate painting into my art style. And I've fallen very in love with this process and this method. I very much like I can't use just one paint pen brand. I found that like I need the different tip types to actually kind of achieve the level of detail that I want, but it just kind of really ends up annoying me when I'm working on something and I have to wait for the paint pen to refill. Whereas if I was just working with the paint out of the tube, it happens for me, right? I just squeeze the tube and I have more paint. I can keep going. But as I knock my medication over, but as I continue to kind of try and work with paintbrushes every time I try, I'm reminded that painting is an incredibly uncomfortable physical process for me with my health condition. And it's been just kind of a really annoying process to have to kind of figure out like when to give and take with the painting process. And as much as I love the experience of sitting down and using the pens, I just wish that I had a more robust system in place for when I actually want to illustrate something. I know it's not the most interesting topic that I explore on my channel for a lot of people, but I haven't checked in about drawing and creating art with a disability recently and how that has been going, if I found any more solutions that have been working for me. And I did kind of want to talk about how the long term use of paint pens has improved my ability to kind of work on illustrations, check in, and how it has helped me to kind of fall in love with art again. And I think that a large part of the thing that pushed me into the art slump alongside the MFA is that you kind of encounter an issue when you're constantly meeting with people who are professionals and professionals who are older and more experienced with you, is that they maybe don't have quite the same level of like empathy or readiness to understand where you're coming from. And there's a particular piece that's like a great example of how this kind of occurred for me in like real time. And I was like, I don't know how to articulate myself to you because you have this mindset. And that was my NYX oil pastel drawing. And I don't really need to show it here. Like, the whole point of it was that I was talking about how it was my first time really using oil pastels. That is also a video on my channel if you're interested in watching it. But it was my first time really using oil pastels and how there is a huge limitation in the oil pastels that I personally have. And then the way that it kind of fits into my art style and the things that I like to have in any singular given illustration that I create, right? And so that would be like the super long eyelashes that I love to add. Having the detail circles all over the place is a lot harder to do when you have a broad, flat tipped medium. You know, there's no brush tip to it. It's not a fine tip. It is literally a circle that's like bigger than, well, you know, like the tip of my thumb, but like flat. You know, it's just kind of a crayon without a tip, right? And how I was having a hard time grappling with wasting medium to sharpen the crayon and how to like do that as somebody who isn't really accustomed to oil pastels. I don't know, like, can you just scrape it off and put it somewhere and use it later? Can you mix it with something to turn it into a paste? Like, I don't know. And I was like talking about how I was just having a really bad time with the medium. It really wasn't for me in terms of my art style. And the response I got was, so you're upset because they weren't really performing the way you expected them to. And the answer to that is no. They performed exactly how I expected them to, but they're really uncomfortable and hard for me to use, and I can't get details because I don't have the dexterity and mobility in my hands to create fine lines with something that's like a broad tipped circle, right? Yeah, you can just tilt it on the edge, but for me, with shaky hands and wrist pain and how short they are, I just found that using oil pastels was a really unpleasant experience, like in retrospect. I think in my video, I had a lot more of a positive kind of outlook and I was like excited to use them again. And that's because I filmed the voiceover the like day after I finished the drawing, if not that night. And the wrist pain that accrued from spending all of that time there, holding those tiny oil pastels in my hands, I was in chronic hand pain with like really bad neuropathy in every time I like moved my thumb, it felt like my tendons are being ripped out for the next like week and a half. And I mean, maybe something else happened there, but I'm pretty confident as an artist who's had a chronic illness this whole time that like it was from holding and curling my hand around something that was just too small for me to hold, you know? It's kind of like how I really only write with my sumo grip mechanical pencils because they're the only ones that are big enough that I own that I can write for a long enough period of time without extreme pain. And it's kind of awkward. I feel really kind of weird when I'm in situations face to face with people where I feel the need to like preface something with I didn't enjoy this experience because it caused me pain, and it's not because I'm like whining or blaming my tools, right? Because there is kind of a stereotype and kind of like a bias, like only a bad artist blames their tools. And, you know, to an extent, I agree. You can make beautiful art with absolutely anything. But at the exact same time, I really do need to take care of myself, and it makes absolutely zero sense to me why I would use a tool that makes my pain worse. And so I'm going to maybe say I didn't like this experience, I don't like this drawing, I had a bad time like creating it, or I maybe enjoyed the experience, but the after experience was so bad that it like was tainted for me. And you know, when I'm on the internet and I'm talking about art and I have the space, like an hour to sit here and talk to you guys about how the process went, how I felt. And when I'm smart and I give myself enough time to continue talking about like how I felt like a couple days after I finished the drawing, then it feels right. You know, I have time to kind of share my thoughts and ruminate on it. But I'm finding it really awkward to have to be like, I didn't like this because it hurt me. And that's kind of been another issue I've been running into every time I talk about the experience of painting. You know, one of my MFA professors is a painter, like, that's his thing. I've actually never seen his work now that I think about it, but he, like, painting is his thing. And I get kind of encouraged towards painting a lot by him, and I'm sure that's because it's his dominant medium. And I do work well with paint, just not paint in the traditional form, and he is a traditionalist at heart. And, you know, at times I just feel like I feel awkward and embarrassed to be like, I don't know how to tell you this, but paintbrushes are so uncomfortable to hold. They're painful. And I'm working through the process of figuring out the solution, but I'm not there yet. You know, I don't paint enough. I don't feel inclined to painting enough that I have found the answer to hand pain as it applies to paintbrushes, right? I have found for ballpoint pens, like the really standard, stereotypical, like cheap Bic pen, I have found that a double layered pen grip, like a squishy pen grip, is exactly what I need. Like the pen grips that I got are exactly what I need. And, you know, like double gripping my pens, you know, they last a while. It's all good. I don't need to wash my pens, but I don't want to have to modify all of my art supplies to be able to use them and enjoy them. That's why I was so drawn to markers in the first place. They just naturally come in those like thick barreled formats, which are good for my hands to grip and they feel okay. And that's why I never did end up being particularly inclined to painting, despite, if I was completely, perfectly, fundamentally the most healthy person on the planet when I was younger, I think I would have been an ink based illustrator. I loved ink when I was younger. It really was my thing. I liked doing ink washes, but I just found it really uncomfortable. And so I just moved on to other mediums. And that's kind of how I've always felt about painting. And these Artix paint pens have the perfect barrel shape for me. Not perfect. Like, I would prefer them a little bit thicker and all of that and like tapered. But, like, when I don't want to be any more choosy than I already am. Like, they're a really good size for me compared to other paint pen brands that I've worked with. And I really like them for their shape. And then, I find that they're really lacking in certain color areas where I'm like, why do you have no colors here? And it's just kind of frustrating because I feel like no matter what, there's just like no perfect option, Like, there's no paint pen brand that has the paint that, like, the range of colors I would like, in a barrel size I like with a brush tip, and it's just like eternally frustrating, And it's kind of a stupid and it's definitely a more privileged thing to complain about. Like, wow, I can't, like, work with just one brand, to feel comfortable, I have to pull out my paint a lot of the time still to get the colors I want, or just do with a illustration that isn't actually as satisfying or well-rounded as I wanted it to be. And when I'm talking about the Arctics lacking in colors, those are specifically browns and red. They have like one red color, maybe two, I think. The rest is like orange, and like, no, I don't even think they have a red that's as red as the marker I laid down. Like, their red is really lacking. Their brown's really lacking, and a lot of my characters have brown hair. Um, and I just, it's not great. I have to go mix paint, and then I have to work with paintbrushes, and they hurt. And like, ideally, I would just find a paintbrush that fits my hand the way I want. I've just haven't found it yet. And frankly, I just haven't even seen paintbrushes online that look like they're going to be comfortable, especially as somebody who does a lot of detail work. It just hasn't been jiving with me. And it's just been kind of a frustration lately. Like, it's not the end of the world. Obviously, I'm going to keep creating art. It's just when I'm thinking about the long terms of my artistic practice, being an artist and having a worsening and incurable condition, I'm gonna live a full life probably, but it is still an incurable chronic illness that does get worse over time, and things become more painful over time. When I'm sitting down and I'm making these decisions, I know it's kind of stupid, but I think, like, are the consequences worth it? Is it worth it to have like pulsating severe hand pain for the next week for the sake of like having the color I want? And often the answer is no, and I do it anyway. And I think that that is kind of something that's been impacting like the enjoyability of art. And I it feels so stupid to say this, but like, I think that maybe I've been kind of like associating the lingering pain from working with certain mediums and materials with having a bad time with art in general, and then I put off creating art because my hand hurts so bad, and I'm not ambidextrous. Let me tell you, I cannot draw with my left hand to save my life, right? Um and I think that learning to really just like actually take care of myself and make proper decisions, limit the amount of time I sit in one sketchbook session, taking breaks, and actually really thinking about like the possible health consequences. I know that is kind of silly. Like, really, honestly, this sketch took me an hour and a half to finish if you count the parts that I cut out, and not including cleanup. And like, an hour and a half shouldn't be too long to draw, especially because I like turned off the camera for a 20-minute work meeting at some point. But like it is too long for me. And I need to just kind of be aware of that and remember that I have to pace myself differently than other people and that I need to really figure out my core mediums that I like to work with and inventory them so that when I'm sitting down, I'm able to tell when I'm likely to need to do extra work, or maybe I'm going to have to set aside a time and a day where I can strain myself without it impacting my job. And it feels wrong when you're my age, when you're as young as I am, having to like plan things according to pain, but I haven't done that before and I haven't really been doing that. And I've been noticing that I've been like having more issues gripping my materials, and I think it's just because I'm not taking care of myself the way I need to. And I need to kind of focus on creating more art that falls in the lane of perhaps like generally marker and the paint pen illustration, and then really just kind of like maybe once or twice a month go through and do tiny detail fixes that require paintbrushes, you know, when I'm able to do it without me needing my hands much for work the next day or the next 2 days so that I can rest and actually take care of myself, I think it's kind of it's not similar to carpal tunnel. That's not what I have. You know what I mean? But carpal tunnel is kind of very likely and very in the cards. But when you're an artist, you need to be aware like carpal tunnel is a possibility, right? So take care of yourself now, right? Like I think we're all like aware that there's a stereotype of artists getting carpal tunnel and getting hand related conditions because they work themselves so much, and like I think I need to just like actually implement a proper like healthcare protocol so that I am accounting for myself. And I think I need to advocate for that in general, not just like in my own life, but for people who have hand pain or are worried about carpal tunnel. Like we need to take care of ourselves, and I haven't been doing that, and that was really stupid of me. And I've been enjoying art less because of it. And so sitting down and really actually only using my paintbrush in this video for the singular original goal that I had planned it, taking the time where I set aside my stuff, I stopped for a while, I took a break, and I prepped everything so that I would not go overboard. I took out the colors I needed and I put the rest of the paint away so I wouldn't feel compelled to grab more and keep going and keep pushing myself. And I think it actually worked. Like, I know it's bonkers, but like having to think about the way that I process information and the way I get when I'm creating and being like, okay, if I see more colors, I'm going to want to use more colors. I picked them out. I put them down on my desk. I put the rest of the colors where I couldn't see them. And then I did the stuff with the paintbrush. And it worked well. And I think that I probably would have gone overboard if I had access to all those colors in the first place. So, like, it helped the piece, it helped me, and it really just kind of made everything work out for me, I guess would be the best way to say it. And I know it's silly, but I haven't had people in my life to kind of tell me the silly things like you need to think about the long-term impacts of your health and like take care of your hands. You're an artist, carpal tunnel is a thing. You have hand pain already. And actually implementing proper self-care as an artist is something that like I've never thought of probably. Like, actually, how do you take care of yourself as an artist and make sure that your artistic muscles are all working good and that you are actually like tending to your needs and accounting for the way that this hobby can like impact you later down the line if you go professional. Like people with crochet experience a lot of hand pain because not like all crochet people, but like crochet needles are very thin. And, there's that whole kind of drama around the kind of handle extender for crochet needles and like how you can kind of like limit the impacts of crochet and like knitting and things like that. And I feel like advocating for self-care for myself and talking about how I'm going to practice doing artistic self-care is going to make it one, easier to implement because I'll be holding myself accountable, but it'll make me feel a little bit less awkward about saying, I didn't like a medium because it was uncomfortable to use. Because it does kind of feel like blaming the tools and saying, like, I'm the failure because I can't use it, and not me saying, like, it's uncomfortable. I hated the experience and therefore I don't need to use it, right? Like, I need to not let myself punish myself for feeling like me not being able to use a particular medium is like a slight against myself as an artist. Like, I liked the oil pastels when I was using them. They were great. I actually had a pretty good time despite my gripes with it, but the lingering after effects made it not worth it. And so, am I going to use oil pastels in the future? Yeah, but I'm going to use it to accent art projects, add texture, and like zhuzh up things to have a little bit of spice. I'm not going to do full oil pastel illustrations because they hurt to use and they're uncomfortable. And the consequences of that art project, which I couldn't foresee because I've never worked with something that small before and hard to hold, were not worth it, right? And I need to like process that and like learn when it's like me having a learning barrier and me just needing to be like, it's not for me. It's not for me. It's not a medium I'm ever going to get like all like cozy with. And I know it's additionally silly. I'm going to just continue calling myself silly, I guess. It's additionally silly, but having my teacher be like, so you're blaming the material because it didn't work how you wanted it to, haunted me, has haunted me for the last month. Like, I've been lingering on that day and like how I didn't know how to articulate to a room of strangers because I don't really know my peers. I just kind of know the professors that like it hurt. Like, I didn't like it and I didn't like the experience because it hurt to use. And because it hurt to use, I was having a hard time kind of controlling the medium and it was just not for me. And like, I'm still thinking about it. And I know that's my OCD and I know it's like intrusive thoughts and compulsive thinking and that it is a habit and it's something that I really need to fight against because it is just a mental health related issue and I need to not dwell on things like that. And that is part of like getting through life. But I think I let it swallow me for like the last month ish. And me having my revelation that the MFA was kind of dragging me down artistically and forcing myself to apply expectations that didn't even exist. Letting go of that, like having that revelation that I'm going to create the art I want to create. And if they don't like it, they don't like it. Like, they accepted me into their program for the art I was making without them. I should not be creating a standard for myself when they accepted me for who I was as an artist. Like, I should just keep making the art I want. And I should not change the way that I'm creating art unless there is a critique that truly can improve my skills as an artist, push my composition, push my coloring, push my character design, right? Like, I I'm creating illusions of standards that don't exist. Letting that go, accepting that, and then going into my new semester of college that's starting next week with, okay, I'm going to create the art I want to create. I'm not going to bend to interest or suggestions that don't kind of fit my needs. Like, doing that, having that mindset, and then also additionally, just working with the mediums that are comfortable and not taking it personally when perhaps my teachers don't really understand where I'm coming from. There's a language barrier between us, like not knowing each other well. I have a way of communicating that doesn't jive with everybody, and I get that. So, keeping that in mind, and then also the fact that like we're kind of different, we don't know each other, and so I haven't just like divulged all of my like personal private information about how my health actually impacts me to these people, right? I haven't even talked about how my health actually impacts me on the internet. And I create disability art where I have talked about some of my like darkest disability related experiences. And even then, I haven't dove into like just how much my health actually impacts my day to day living, right? And like all of those other aspects. Like, I need to remember that like people can't read my mind and that I can't take things too personally. And I think that is kind of put me in this better artistic mindset as well, because I'm just kind of feeling more alive and kind of self-exploratory again. I feel like an artist again, and it's really, really been good for me. Let's return to like the main point of this video for the last chunk of time, and that is falling in love with my, and I mean, I suppose your art again. I don't believe that this is necessarily something that is exclusive to me as an artist just because I have health conditions. But learning how to take care of myself as an artist in the last few months have been crucial to making art feel right again. And having the correct mindset around art and really leaving behind kind of some of the bad stuff that started to build up since probably 2022 was kind of critical for me to perhaps being a little bit more free with my art again. And I think you can even kind of see it if you go back in my channel, you go back to my first year on YouTube, you can see how much more free I was with my character designs, the way I talked, and the way I talked about my disability, my experiences, and why I was so passionate about art. I talked about it in a way that was a little bit more detached from myself. And I think that kind of got adopted over time as I tried to get through my undergrad experience and talking about art and my art, and also not letting it be something that was too emotionally upsetting when people didn't like my work, right? I was not naive. Naive isn't the right word, but I've always been a very emotional and soft kind of person. I'm not a very hard, tough person. I take criticism really not personally, but it is something that I have a hard time letting go of, even if it's not necessarily applicable to me and my goals. It is something that haunts me. And so in my undergrad, taking all of those beginner art classes, having people whom were just as naive as I was, now naive actually is the right word, on how to properly critique people and assess basically how you want to kind of approach somebody's art, and also kind of understand that they probably have very different objectives from you when it comes to art. Learning that process with a group of other people, it can be a little bit difficult, right? Learning how to set aside your own personal preference and your own personal biases around the art that you like and don't like and what upsets you in art, and sit down and think to myself, but what do these people need to hear to improve as an artist, is a process, you know? And that's why I hate art criticism as like a field, because I feel like a lot of the time when I read art critiques, even now on blogs, like art criticism back in the day when you had to go to a gallery to see art was bad. Like there was some good stuff. However, I mean, I've read some of the worst garbage I have ever encountered in my art history classes. I mean, I have seen the worst of the gutter mind you can ever imagine. Marcel Duchamp's urinal being likened to a woman's womb for men to dump upon is perhaps the worst thing I've ever had to read and actually take seriously as a form of art criticism. Like, genuinely, what are you on, dude? That's not, like, he told you the point of the piece. You don't need to look deeper, and you don't need to make it weird. Keep this out of here, right? I've encountered a lot of bad art criticism in art history, and not being a bad art critic and being a really constructive and beneficial peer for the people that are trying to build you up and you're trying to build up themselves. Like, how do you become a better artist? How do you improve your craft? Is a skill you have to learn. And I'm someone who went into it knowing I was sensitive and that I needed to approach it in a way where I didn't take it personally all of the time. And I think I kind of just let that simmer and build. And incorporating proper self care as an artist is just something that never really came to mind for me. And so as I sit here now and I watch my dumbass spray literal hand sanitizer on paint so that I can flick specks all over my sketchbook for my own personal amusement and enjoyment, I acknowledge that I am not the brightest, nor am I the most particularly savvy of artists. Because when I went on my rant about incorporating self care and not using paintbrushes in my work and how it's uncomfortable, I'm talking about the fact that I literally set aside time in my sketchbook to make the biggest mess of my desk I have made in ages. First off, don't use paper as a paint palette if you're using hand sanitizer. It's a horrible idea. As much fun as I had and as cool as the paper looks after the fact, not a great plan. Not my brightest moment. But I knew I wanted to have specs, and I knew I wanted the piece to end up looking more impressionistic at the end. Impressionistic isn't the right word. I wanted the guns to really have a power and a poof to them that is unrealistic and not particularly graphic, you know? Um I'm not a huge violence person, personally, and I'm not actually a fan of like actual violence in weapons. I kind of like play weapons, you know? And so these are like smoke guns or something like that. They're not something that could hurt people. This is at least partially because YouTube would hurt me if I said that they could hurt people. And also because I very much knew immediately going into this what I wanted the weapons to look like. I wanted them to have a very soft, cloud-like appeal to them. Some sort of kind of smoky, colorful haze. Not pure white. I wanted an off-white, and I wanted it to match the character in some capacity. So when it came time to actually step away from the piece for a minute, give my hands a break, and do the kind of cloud part and splattering down the paint, I chose a dark blue and a white. Now, I'm not one of those don't mix with white, don't mix with black people. I've gone on rants about how I believe that you can mix with whatever you want. If you like it, you like it. I don't care. Do you, right? So I started by laying down the darkest specks for the darkest shade of blue. And then I dry brushed the best I could. Now I'm using hand sanitizer. It's drying fast. And I'm going through and I'm taking the blobs of paint and I'm smearing them very lightly while keeping a lot of them intact, right? I want them to look like scatter. Scatter is not the word. Debris. I want them to look like debris, but I also wanted to have a cloud, kind of loose, not in focus feel to them. And so it really was kind of my immediate objective to not really care, right? And so I tried not to take anything too seriously. And in that process, I realized I need to also take my own actual base piece and kind of mess it up all over, right? I originally wanted the face and the chunk of hair I gave up on, which is next to the gun that's kind of overpowering the hair. I originally was only planning to really mess that up, but I realized it doesn't make sense for the piece for the bottom part to be in focus, right? And so I really wanted to kind of just start smudging everything. I wanted you to not be able to effectively distinguish between where the gun starts and where the hair really ends, and all of those things. And it turns out, unfortunately, I'm blind. Not actually blind, but I have bad eyesight. I have an astigmatism. I can't see in the dark very well at all. And I could not see my own piece in the previous lighting. It looks the same on camera as it did in person. Um, I needed this bright light to actually see what I was doing. I just could not see. And so it's a little bit glary for you guys, but it was necessary for me to actually get anything done because I was absolutely losing track of myself. And slowly over time, I built up more and more kind of tones of blue, more like intense hand sanitizer dosages. kind of like a stockpile so that it was much looser, easier to flick around, and kind of just building up layers of different shades of blue. As for the hand sanitizer, I forgot to bring water over from my sink, and I was already sitting with a hot water bottle on my lower back. And the hand sanitizer I keep on my desk 24/7 in case I need it for various reasons, one of those being spilling my beverages. I use hand sanitizer and a microfiber cloth to clean up my messes. Um, so the hand sanitizer was there, and I said to myself, I mean, it can't be that bad. And here is a review of the process. The only thing that was negatively impacted by the hand sanitizer was there is some bleeding and weird splattery patterns on the green page because that is an alcohol marker base, and I was spraying the piece of paper for the palette directly on top of it. And it looks cool, and I'm going to cover it anyway, so I don't care. But splattering hand sanitizer down paint did not negatively impact the red background layer. It is completely intact. It is fine. It didn't really seem to do anything. So nothing went wrong, and I would say that it was a mission success. I do not know if this will change light fastness. It's in a sketchbook, so it doesn't really matter, or if it'll over time cause issues, but for now, it works fine. Also, the hand sanitizer dried paint was easier to wipe off my hand by soaking my hand in sanitizer and then wiping it on my paint cloth that I keep at my desk at all times. So it overall worked out because dry paint on my hands makes me incredibly angry and irritated. It's a textural thing and it bothers the life out of me. Like, I can't handle it. Like, it gets to a point where as soon as it's like dry, I need to stop. I need to change everything that I'm doing and immediately get it off of my skin or I will lose my mind. So, the hand sanitizer method worked really well. I ended up looking a little bit smurfy, but that's fine. And overall, the more that I smeared, the more that I messed around and I got playful with the piece, the messier the situation got in terms of my desk, the more fun I realized I was having. And I kind of found myself in a position where I forgot that I was really actually doing anything and that I had an objective. I was having such a good time making a mess and just splattering the paint everywhere. While it was uncomfortable and my pointer finger is now incredibly sore, like only my pointer finger is irritated from this process, um, it was worth it. I had a great time. I really enjoyed every part of this process, this experience, and I love the sketchbook page. And I think that if you watch my Bog Lady video, which was my last art piece for 2024, you watch my last video where I was talking about how much fun I was having just doing stuff in my sketchbook and all of that, I think that I'm feeling like an artist again, and it has been an incredibly rewarding experience to finally take care of myself as a human and thus take care of myself as an artist. And so I am able to actually think of art creation as something that is entirely and exclusively fun and not just something that is also kind of like my homework for school, you know? And it feels right again, and I feel very happy because the slump that I was in for the kind of past 6 months was consuming, and every time I felt like I was getting out of it, I would get dragged back in, and I would make videos once a month saying, I think I finally figured out what's wrong, and I didn't, and now for 3 weeks in a row, I have felt great. I've loved the art that I've been making. I have been enjoying my bad sketch days. I have learned when to stop and give up on a piece because I'm just not loving it anymore. And it has been such an incredibly rewarding experience to just make art and give up on art when I'm not happy with it anymore. And to just kind of let my sketchbook be a place for complete chaos and a mess. And I'm happy. I'm happy. I like this piece. I like how it turned out. I like the mess I made. And while I am now facing the consequences of my action, I think that I have finally fallen in love with art properly again. Not to say that I didn't love art before, not to say that I haven't loved art the past 6 months, 8 months, a year, but I don't think I realized how little fun I was having compared to how fun it's been, I guess. Like, it was fun before, but now I'm infatuated, right? And I've always talked about how being an artist is like necessary for me to like survive and function. Being an artist is something that is just fundamental to my being. And that is true entirely. I could never just stop creating art in some capacity. There's always photography that I'm going to do if I can't work my hands enough to paint and things like that. But I don't I don't think that being intrinsically an artist is the same thing as every time you sit down feeling like you're with yourself and having the time of your life. Like, I don't know how to articulate it, but I feel it feels right again. It feels like it used to before kind of getting a degree in art kind of caught up to me. You know, I didn't start college with an art degree. I started it with a botany degree. I added my art degree in my third year, right? I think once I added my art degree in my third year, art wasn't just art. Art was now school. Art was now my education. I was paying to get good at art, right? And it wasn't the same. And now I'm paying to get good at art with a goal. I'm getting my MFA for a reason. And I need to update my should you get an MFA video. And I think I need to kind of talk a little bit more specifically about why I personally don't think you should get an MFA unless you have a very specific career goal in mind. But I it feels right, you know, trying not to tie your worth as an artist to whether you have an education, how good your art is so important. Art and how you value yourself as an artist should always be about the experience of creating art. Do you love what you're doing? Do you feel fulfilled? Do you love creating? And if the answer is yes, then you're an artist, and that's that. Unless you do AI image generation, then you're not an artist. Leave me alone and get out of my life. um, but if you are like creating something, like actually creating something, then you're an artist. AI image generation does not count. So I think I've talked enough, and it's time for me to set you all free until next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching all the way through to the end of this video. Like the video if you like it, dislike if you dislike, comment if you have anything you want to say or you want to talk to me, subscribe if you want to see more of my content. And I suppose that with all of this being said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, night, wherever you are. Bye-bye.